A diesel locomotive is a type of railway locomotive in which the prime mover is a diesel engine. Several types of diesel locomotive have been developed, differing mainly in the means by which mechanical power is conveyed to the driving wheels. Overview. Early internal combustion engine-powered locomotives and rail motors used gasoline as their fuel. Soon after Dr. Rudolf Diesel patented his first compression-ignition engine in 1892, it was considered for railway propulsion. Progress was slow, however, as several problems had to be overcome. Power transmission was a primary concern. As opposed to steam and electric engines, internal combustion engines work efficiently only within a limited range of turning frequencies. In light vehicles, this could be overcome by a clutch. In heavy railway vehicles, mechanical transmission never worked well or else wore out too soon. Experience with early gasoline-powered locomotives and rail cars was valuable for the development of diesel traction. One step towards diesel-electric transmission was the petrol-electric vehicle, such as the Weitzer rail motor. Steady improvements in diesel design gradually reduced its physical size and improved its power-to-weight ratio to a point where one could be mounted in a locomotive. Once the concept of diesel-electric drive was accepted, the pace of development quickened, and by 1925 a small number of diesel locomotives of 600 horsepower were in service in the United States. In 1930, Armstrong Whitworth of the United Kingdom delivered two 1,200 horsepower locomotives using engines of Sulzer designed to Buenos Aires Great Southern Railway of Argentina. By the mid-1950s, with economic recovery from the Second World War, production of diesel locomotives had begun in many countries and the diesel locomotive was on its way to becoming the dominant type of locomotive. It offered greater flexibility and performance than the steam locomotive, as well as substantially lower operating and maintenance costs, other than where electric traction was in use due to policy decisions. Currently, almost all diesel locomotives are diesel-electric, although the diesel-hydraulic type was widely used between the 1950s and 1970s. History. Adaptation of the diesel engine for rail use. Earliest recorded examples of an internal combustion engine for railway use included a prototype, designed by William Dent Priestman, which was examined by Sir William Thomson in 1888, who described it as a Priestman oil engine, mounted upon a truck which is worked on a temporary line of rails to show the adaptation of a petroleum engine for locomotive purposes. In 1894, a 20 HP, two-axle machine built by Priestman Brothers was used on the Hull docks. In 1896, an oil-engined railway locomotive was built for the Royal Arsenal, Woolwich, England, in 1896, using an engine designed by Herbert Ackroyd Stewart. It was not, strictly, a diesel because it used a hot bulb engine, but it was the precursor of the diesel. Following the expiration of Dr. Rudolf Diesel's patent in 1912, his engine design was successfully applied to marine propulsion and stationary applications. However, the massiveness and poor power-to-weight ratio of these early engines made them unsuitable for propelling land-based vehicles. Therefore, the engine's potential as a railroad prime mover was not initially recognized. This change as development reduced the size and weight of the engine. The world's first diesel-powered locomotive was operated in the summer of 1912 on the Winterthur-Romanshorn Railroad in Switzerland, but was not a commercial success. In 1906, Rudolf Diesel, Adolf Klosar and the steam and diesel engine manufacturer Gebude Sulzer founded Diesel Sulzer Klosar GmbH to manufacture diesel-powered locomotives. Sulzer had been manufacturing diesel engines since 1898. The Prussian State Railways ordered a diesel locomotive from the company in 1909, and after test runs between Winterthur and Romanshorn, the diesel mechanical locomotive was delivered in Berlin in September 1912. During further test runs in 1913, several problems were found. After the First World War broke out in 1914, all further trials were stopped. The locomotive weight was 95 tons and the power was 883 kilowatts with a maximum speed of 100 kilometers per hour. Small numbers of prototype diesel locomotives were produced in a number of countries through the mid-1920s. Advance of diesel traction in the U.S. Early American developments. Adolphus Busch purchased the American manufacturing rights for the diesel engine in 1898 but never applied this new form of power to transportation. He founded the Busch-Sulzer Company in 1911. Only limited success was achieved in the early 20th century with direct-driven gasoline and diesel-powered railcars. General Electric entered the railcar market in the early 20th century, as Thomas Edison possessed a patent on the electric locomotive, his design actually being a type of electrically propelled railcar. GE built its first electric locomotive prototype in 1895. However, high electrification costs caused GE to turn its attention to diesel power to provide electricity for electric railcars. Problems related to coordinating the diesel engine and electric motor were immediately encountered, primarily due to limitations of the Ward-Leonard electric elevator drive system that had been chosen. A significant breakthrough occurred in 1914, when Hermann Lemp, a GE electrical engineer, developed and patented a reliable direct current electrical control system. Lemp's design used a single lever to control both engine and generator in a coordinated fashion, and was the prototype for all diesel-electric locomotive control systems. Following this development, the 1923 Kaufman Act banned steam locomotives from New York City because of severe pollution problems. The response to this law was to electrify high-traffic rail lines. However, electrification was uneconomical to apply to lower traffic areas. The first regular use of diesel-electric locomotives was in switching applications. General Electric produced several small switching locomotives in the 1930s. Westinghouse Electric and Baldwin collaborated to build switching locomotives starting in 1929. However, the Great Depression curtailed demand for Westinghouse's electrical equipment, and they were stopped building locomotives internally, opting to supply electrical parts instead. First American series production locomotives. General Electric continued to be interested in developing a practical diesel railway locomotive, and approached Ingersoll Rand in 1924. The resulting 300-horsepower locomotive was fitted with an electrical generator and traction motors supplied by GE, as well as a form of Lemp's control system, and was delivered in July 1925. This locomotive demonstrated that the diesel-electric power unit could provide many of the benefits of an electric locomotive without the railroad having to bear the sizable expense of electrification. The unit successfully demonstrated in switching, road freight and passenger service, on a baker's dozen of railroads, and became the prototype for 33 units of 600 horsepower AGEIR box carb switching locomotives built by a consortium of GE, IR and the American Locomotive Company for several New York City railroads. In June 1925, Baldwin Locomotive Works outshopped a prototype diesel-electric locomotive for special uses, using electrical equipment from Westinghouse Electric Company. Its twin-engine design was not successful, and the unit was scrapped after a short testing and demonstration period. Industry sources were beginning to suggest the outstanding advantages of this new form of motive power. In 1929, the Canadian National Railways became the first North American railway to use diesels in mainline service with two units, 9000 and 9001, from Westinghouse. Diesel-electric railroad locomotion entered the American mainstream when the Burlington Railroad and Union Pacific used diesel streamliners to haul passengers, both since 1934. Following the successful 1939 tour of General Motors EMD's FT demonstrator freight locomotive set, the transition from steam to diesel power began, the pace substantially quickening in the years following the close of World War II. Fairbanks Morse developed a unique opposed piston engine that was used in their locomotives, as well as in submarines. Early diesel-electric locomotives in the United States used direct current traction motors, but alternating current motors came into widespread use in the 1990s, starting with the electromotive SD70MAC in 1993 and followed by the General Electric's AC4400CW in 1994 and AC6000CW in 1995. Early diesel locomotives and rail cars in Europe. First functional diesel vehicles in 1914. World's first functional diesel-electric rail cars were produced for the Königliche Sächsische Staatseisenbahnen by Wagon Fabrik Rastatt with electric equipment from Brown, Boveri and CIE and diesel engines from Swiss Sulzer AG. They were classified as Det 1 and Det 2. Due to shortage of petrol products during World War I, they remained unused for regular service in Germany. In 1922, they were sold to Swiss Compagnie du Chemin de Fer Régional du Val de Travers, where they were used in regular service up to the electrification of the line in 1944. Afterwards, the company kept them in service as boosters till 1965. Fiat claims the first Italian diesel-electric locomotive built in 1922, but little detail is available. A Fiat Tib diesel locomotive, of 440 CV, is reported to have entered service on the Ferrovie Calabro Lucana in southern Italy in 1926. Following trials in 1924-5. In 1924, 2 diesel-electric locomotives were taken in service by the Soviet railways, almost at one time. The engine 2 started on October 22. It had been designed by a team led by Yuri Lomonosov and built 1923-1924 by Maschine and Fabrik Esslingen in Germany. It had 5 driving axles. After several test rides, it hauled trains for almost 3 decades from 1925 to 1954. Though proved to be world's first functional diesel locomotive, it didn't become a series, but it became a model for several classes of Soviet diesel locomotives. The engine 1 started on November 9. It had been developed by Yakov Modestovich Gakel and built by Baltic Shipyard in St. Petersburg. It had 10 driving axles in 3 bogies. From 1925 to 1927, it hauled trains between Moscow and Kursk in Caucasus region. Due to technical problems, afterwards it was out of service. Since 1934, it was used as a stationary electric generator. In 1935, Krauss Maffei, Mann and Voith built the first diesel hydraulic locomotive, called V140, in Germany. The German railways being very pleased with the performance of that engine. Diesel hydraulics became the mainstream in diesel locomotives in Germany. Serial production of diesel locomotives in Germany began after World War II. Switches in many railway stations and industrial compounds. Steam shunters had to be kept hot during lots of lazy breaks between scattered short tasks. Therefore, diesel traction became economic for shunting, before it became economic for hauling trains. The construction of diesel shunters began in 1920 in France, in 1925 in Denmark, in 1926 in the Netherlands, and in 1927 in Germany. After few years of testing, hundreds of units were produced within a decade. Diesel rail cars for regional traffic. Diesel-powered or oil-engined rail cars, generally diesel mechanical, were developed by various European manufacturers in the 1930s, e.g., by William Beardmore and Company for the Canadian National Railways. Some of those series for regional traffic were begun with gasoline motors and then continued with diesel motors, such as Hungarian BC Mo. 128 cars built 1926 to 1937, or German Wismar rail buses. In France, the first diesel railcar was Renault VH 115 units produced 1933-34. In Italy, after 6 gasoline cars since 1931, Fiat and Breda built a lot of diesel rail motors. More than 110 from 1933 to 1938 and 390 from 1940 to 1953, Class 772 known as Littorina, and Class ALN 900. High-speed rail cars in the 1930s, streamlined high-speed diesel rail cars were developed in several countries. In Germany, the Flying Hamburger was built in 1932. After a test ride in December 1932, this two-coach diesel railcar started service at Deutsche Reichsbahn in February 1933. It became the prototype of DRG Class SVT 137 with 33 more high-speed DMUs built for DRG till 1938, 13 DMU2, 18 DMU3, and 2 DMU4. French SNCF classes XF 1000 and XF 1100 comprised 11 high-speed DMUs, also called TAR, built 1934 to 1939. In Hungary, Gansworks built Arpad rail motor, a kind of a luxurious rail bus in a series of 7 items since 1934, and started to build Hargita DMU amazingly in 1944. Diesel overcomes steam in 1945. A batch of 30 Baldwin diesel-electric locomotives, Baldwin 0660100, was delivered from the United States to the railways of the Soviet Union. In 1947, the London Midland and Scottish Railway introduced the first of a pair of 1,600 horsepower Coco diesel-electric locomotives for regular use in the United Kingdom. Although British manufacturers such as Armstrong Whitworth had been exporting diesel locomotives since 1930, fleet deliveries to British Railways, of other designs such as Class 20 and Class 31, began in 1957. Series production of diesel locomotives in Italy began in the mid-1950s. Generally, diesel traction in Italy was of less importance than in other countries, as it was amongst the most advanced countries in electrification of the main lines and, as a result of Italian geography, even on many domestic connections, freight transport overseas is cheaper than rail transport. Early diesel locomotives and rail cars in Asia. In Japan, since the 1920s, some petrol-electric rail cars were produced. The first diesel-electric traction and the first air-streamed vehicles on Japanese rails were the 2 DMU-3S of Class Keiha 43,000. Japan's first series of diesel locomotives was Class DD-50. Twin locomotives, developed since 1950 and in service since 1953. China. One of the first home-developed diesel vehicles of China was the DMU Dongfeng, produced in 1958 by CSR Sifang. Series production of China's first diesel locomotive class, the DFH-1, began in 1964 following construction of a prototype in 1959. Early diesel locomotives and rail cars in Australia. The Trans-Australian Railway, built 1912 to 1917 by Commonwealth Railways, passes through 2,000 kilometres of waterless desert terrain unsuitable for steam locomotives. The original engineer Henry Dean envisaged diesel operation to overcome such problems. Some have suggested that the CR worked with the South Australian Railways to trial diesel traction. However, the technology was not developed enough to be reliable. As in Europe, the usage of internal combustion engines advanced more readily in self-propelled railcars than in locomotives. Some Australian railway companies bought McKean railcars. In the 1920s and 1930s, more reliable gasoline rail motors were built by Australian industries. Australia's first diesel rail cars were NSWGR 400 and 500 class in 1938. High-speed vehicles for those days' possibilities on 3 feet 6 in were the 10 Vulcan rail cars of 1940 for New Zealand.